what I'm going to talk about today is field work that we did last summer in Greenland, where we deployed GPS on icebergs to try to measure the melt rate of icebergs. This is quite different than I'm sure a lot of people have done. It was very different for us. As Laura alluded to, not only was our surface melting underneath us, but it was also completely with the will of the ocean. So it was also drifting away from us and with the currents. And so that led to us needing to be very creative in how we processed these data, how we deployed our GPSs, which icebergs we decided to instrument. So that's a little bit of what I will talk about today. What we did last season, why we did it, how we did it, what we learned from it, some initial results, and why we even study icebergs at all. So as Laura mentioned, there's a lot of meltwater that's going into Greenland, or from Greenland into the oceans right now. What doesn't go in as meltwater goes in as icebergs. And these icebergs account for probably about close to 50% of the mass loss from Greenland. And with these icebergs, as they're melting, they're now injecting meltwater into different locations as they travel. And so knowing where they are melting within the water column and where in the ocean that meltwater is going, that impacts global ocean circulation, and specifically meridional overturning, which is right to the southeast of Greenland. So knowing exactly how much is coming out and where these icebergs are going and when and where they're melting is pretty important. So a lot of studies have been done trying to figure out how icebergs melt. The first studies were really done because they wanted to take icebergs from the Arctic and the Antarctic and drag them by boat to places that didn't have water, so out to the deserts. Once they realized that most of your iceberg will melt in the time that it takes you to get from the Antarctic or the Arctic, those studies were kind of stopped, and there was a hiatus in talking about how icebergs melt. And then once it became known or understood that these icebergs actually have other implications and other uses beyond just freshwater, trying to figure out how they're melting and where they're melting became more of an important study, both through modeling and through remote sensing. But both of these methods need ground truthing. And especially with remote sensing, it's limited by both image availability and image resolution. And so as you'll see in the picture, there's a lot of forces at play that impact how an iceberg melts, including the waves that it runs into, the wind, the turbulence in the ocean, the circulation, and also the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water. And so what we are really looking at, if we look at how the iceberg is on its own, about 10% of that mass is going to be above water, just knowing the density of ice and the density of water. About 90% of that mass is underwater. So if the water is now melting our iceberg quicker than the air, which generally happens, here let's say that this is our new melt line. So all of this doesn't exist anymore. So now we're in a situation where below water is less than 90% of the mass, and above water is more than 90% of the mass. And we want to get back to this 10% above, 90% below. So what's going to happen is that surface is going to lower. And now this is an observable measurement that we can make that directly relates back to how much icebergs are melting and how much meltwater is being discharged. So that was primarily our goal for this study, was to figure out what this ice lowering rate is and where this is happening. And so, like I said, our project goal was to use in situ measurements to capture iceberg melt at high spatial and high temporal resolution to better constrain meltwater flux calculations. To do this, we had 4 high-resolution GPS available to us. We had 2 that UNAVCO built for us and 2 that MIT built for us. But we had to figure out where we were going to put these, what was going to be our priority. And for us, we wanted to know the Z direction. We wanted the highest resolution we could in that vertical change. And so for us, this meant that we wanted to look at differential processing. So we wanted at least 2 GPS per iceberg, and we didn't have a base station. So this meant that we weren't going to get the best resolution or the lowest errors when it came to absolute position, but because our iceberg is moving everywhere. Really what we were interested in is, again, this vertical change. We also had to think about how important the information on iceberg flexure is. So how quickly is the iceberg disintegrating? Is it coming apart? And to get that information, we needed at least 4 GPS on an iceberg. And we only had 4 available. So did we want to instrument just one iceberg? Or did we want to instrument 2? So we decided that flexure wasn't as important, and we wanted another data point. So we doubled our N value from 1 to 2. So we had 2 icebergs that we looked at this last summer. In order to decide which icebergs we should pick, we had some logistic concerns. One, we needed to collect these GPS at the end, so we couldn't have icebergs that tipped over. Again, this is such a power draw that we couldn't telemetry this data back, and these are really expensive units, and I don't think UNAVCO would be very happy with us if we just said, oh, it's a drift, don't worry. So we needed to collect these back, so we needed pretty large icebergs. Additionally, we needed icebergs large enough to land a helicopter on or hover over to deploy these. These are not icebergs. These are recently calved icebergs. They have flakes coming off of them. They're not ones that we're going to ice climb up. So only accessible by helicopter. We also wanted to have some sort of a ridge or a plateau that was present on these icebergs. The first was to reduce the localized melting. So we didn't want it to be in the shadow. We wanted to know what the overall lowering rate is, not just in a local location on this iceberg. And the second one is that we didn't want it to be in a low where potentially meltwater from the surface would pool. Just like as in Laura's talk, we did not want to sink or drown our GPSs. It also needed to be accessible by boat. And this was because when we after we first deployed these GPSs, we then went and surveyed them by boat. So we wanted to know what the water conditions were around these icebergs. So we needed icebergs that we could get to. So they couldn't be in a really dense melange. They couldn't be 80 kilometers away. We just weren't going to be able to get to them by boat. So they needed to be somewhere probably mid-fjord. Additional variables that impact these height measurements are tides. So since we're only measuring the z direction, every time the tide comes in and comes out, we're going to see that in our record. Changes in air pressure, and also changes in the difference between the geoid and the ellipsoid. So because these icebergs are moving, they're going to all different varieties of this difference. They're moving all over. So these are other considerations that we need to do, or post-processing we need to do on these data in order to get them to a point where all we're looking at is the surface lowering rate. And so our field location was Surmullic Fjord, which is in southeast Greenland. If we zoom into this orange box, Surmullic Fjord is where Helheim drains. Helheim is the fastest glacier in Greenland on the east coast. In the summertime, it can move up to about 30 meters a day. It's 5 kilometers across, about 3/4 of a kilometer thick. And icebergs in this fjord are pretty large. So we felt pretty confident that we were going to be able to find icebergs that were going to remain upright and we could access and a helicopter could land. And so we instrumented our 2 icebergs, aptly named the UNAVCO iceberg and the MIT iceberg. We're really creative in the field. Here, in these GPSs, again, it's a differential GPS, so 2 on each iceberg. They were measured at 1 second intervals with a vertical resolution of about 1.5 centimeters. And they were deployed for 9 days. So we deployed them by helicopter, we took our boat out, surveyed them, and brought the boat back, went back out in the helicopter and picked them up. So here I'm going to take you guys to Greenland to show you a little bit of what these icebergs, what the size of these icebergs actually look like. So here we are surveying if we should land on this iceberg. So we're trying to see if there's any cracks in it, if there's any instabilities that we see. We don't want these icebergs to break apart or even large flakes to come off of them, because that can lead to tilt because they're floating. So they need to remain in balance based on mass and center of mass. So here we are flying around. This is about an iceberg that's 500 meters across, about 35 meters high out of the water. As you can see, there's even little streams on these. So there's melt, certainly, that happens at the surface. Coming around the corner here, you'll even see a little baby melt pond. We weren't super concerned because of this location. Had that melt pond been at the center, we would have been a little bit more concerned because it could have created weaknesses in the iceberg, and it could have broken it apart. Again, not our goal. So, and here is a quick video of what it's like to actually be on the iceberg and deploying it. So this was a great day. It was sunny, so the helicopter was able to land. It didn't have flat ice. And so just jumped out. We were roped into the helicopter, installed the GPS, and a smaller expendable GPS that had real-time tracking. So the last thing we wanted to do was actually lose this iceberg. Since there's a lot of icebergs out here, we wanted to make sure that when we were in the boat and we were surveying the ocean, we were actually surveying the ocean around the correct iceberg. So those were relayed to us in real time. So here's a picture of these real-time GPS trackers. In that red circle there, those are our two MIT and UNAVCO big icebergs. We were also able to deploy these little trackers on a few other ones up in the melange in your upper left and higher up in the fjord, just to see where those icebergs went. And these were left out because they telemetried the data back. We never collected them, so they remained out there until either the batteries died on them or the icebergs flipped over and they sunk. So the results, what did we see? Well, here's I guess, an overview picture. So we have our two MIT GPSs. They're about 65 meters apart. You can see our boat in the background for scale. And luckily, we also were able to retrieve both of them. So that's on recovery. And that's a picture of the UNAVCO systems that they built for us. So looking at the data, it's a pretty busy plot, but on the y-axis, we have relative height, and on the x-axis, we have time, so just day of year. These are the 9 days that were left out. And in all subsequent plots, we'll have the MIT iceberg on the top and the UNAVCO iceberg on the bottom. The GPS unit number 1 represents the GPS unit that is the closest to the center of the iceberg, where number 2 is the closest to one of the edges of the iceberg. And what we can see initially is we have quite a bit of noise here, but we also have a really great tidal signal. And that's shown here with this tide. But we also were wondering why we had so much noise in this record. And we found out it was actually because of our expendable GPSs, which ironically are called smart ones. And when they telemetried about approximately every hour, it interrupted our high resolution signal. So it gave us errors of 500 meters, which was not ideal. So we filtered out all this data for the really, really high errors. So that's what you see here. And then we removed the tide. So that's what you see here. But our MIT iceberg still had a lot more noise than our UNAVCO one did. And we attributed this to the fact that the UNAVCO, the two units on the UNAVCO iceberg were about 80 to 90 meters apart, whereas the MIT were only about 65. So what was happening is that our expendable GPSs were not only interfering with the GPS unit that was right there, but also the GPS unit that was 65 meters away. So we performed a 3 sigma filtering of this data. So now we have two really nice signals, and you can see a downward trend, which is fantastic. And here's our trend lines. You'll notice the MIT ones, we have an average of 15 centimeters per day in surface lowering. The UNAVCO one, the one that was the closest inland, had about 15 centimeters per day. But the one that was near the edge had about 18 centimeters per day. And so if we zoom into this, we can see it a little bit better. We can also see that these dots don't actually line up on our plots as well as we thought they would. So maybe a linear trend line is not the appropriate trend line to use in this situation. Additionally, we haven't yet filtered out for the air pressure changes or the difference between the ellipsoid and the geoid. So those will certainly change these slopes, but we don't know how much yet. Still to be determined. But there is a difference in slope, and it's not just mechanical. And so that could be due to this iceberg preferentially melting. So if the iceberg is rotating or has one side that is predominant as it moves down the fjord, maybe that side is getting more melt than the other sides. So that's something that we need to look at. But in order to change our surface lowering rate into mass loss, we need to know the iceberg volume. And in order to do that, we need to know the geometry. And this is where all of our boat work comes involved. And so what we did while we were out in the boat going around these icebergs, we used a drone and structure from motion to get our surface DEM. We took about 100 pictures per iceberg. It was less than 20 centimeters spatial resolution. Then also in the boat, we had a multi-beam that was in the water. Historically, multi-beams have really been used to map the seafloor bathymetry, but recently they've been tilted up about 15 degrees to map glacier terminus. So there in the, again, Rink Glacier we were talking about earlier, you can see that map terminus are those vertical lines. And so that's precisely what we did here. So instead of mapping a glacier terminus, we did some circles around the iceberg in order to map the geometry. And the multi-beam resolution, that's just a function of the iceberg depth, the iceberg geometry, the boat speed, the sample rate, so it's variable. And here's what we came up with. So here's our MIT iceberg. Again, we have it about 500 meters across at the surface, 500, almost 600 meters wide underneath the water, and about 250 meters deep. We also see that, at least in this iceberg, it's more of a truncated inverted cone. We see that we have areas of undercutting. So if we look at the bird's eye view down there in the lower right-hand side, we can see colors underneath that iceberg. That's undercutting. On the lower left, we have areas where we have color beyond the surface. Those are areas where we have almost skirts out from underneath the iceberg. So highly variable geometry. We were able to measure, to do this on 5 different icebergs in the fjord. And here's our icebergs that we did. So the MIT one are the 2 icebergs on the left, just in 2 different views. So in the lower one, you can see where that skirt is. In the right upper corner, that's the UNAVCO one. So the UNAVCO one is much, much larger than the MIT berg. And so moving from here, in order to calculate mass loss, we know that the above water volume, calculated from the structure from motion, and knowing both the density of the ice and the density of the water, we can get the below water value or volume. We know the approximate surface lowering, so we can calculate mass loss. And from here, in order to calculate the melt rate, we need to know the submerged surface area. But there are some challenges with this. Specifically, like this region right here. Sometimes when we're going around the iceberg with our multi-beam, we have other icebergs that are nearby, so we actually end up driving the boat over the top of part of the iceberg. Unfortunate, but that just means that we really can't get any information about the iceberg geometry underneath that point. Additionally, the way that the multi-beam is pointed, we don't get any information from directly underneath the iceberg. So these are things that we're trying to resolve right now with meshes and with knowing what the volume should be to approximate the geometry. But we have preliminary melt rates average about 0.46 to 0.73 meters per day, which is much larger than previous estimates. It's probably due to the roughness of these icebergs, but also the very high resolution measurements. So the next steps for the GPS processing, we accounted for the tides, but we have yet to do to account for the changes in the air pressure or that difference between the geoid and the ellipsoid. But there is a significant difference. So the pink and purple lines, that's the MIT iceberg, and the yellow and green lines, those are the UNAVCO iceberg. So we do see that there is variation in this geoid height as both of these icebergs move down fjord. To look at the subsurface geometry, I talked about we need to work on this mesh, but also we were able to survey the MIT and the UNAVCO icebergs twice. And so if we difference those DEMs, we'll be able to see where the melt is occurring, both within the water column and if there's preferential melting and if we get that tilt. And with all of our ocean measurements, we can start to constrain these melt equations with the water property measurements. So this is getting at that bigger question of where is water going that is melting from these icebergs? How fast is that? How fast is water or meltwater going into the ocean and at what depth? And from previous studies that have done similar things as far as mapping, we've been able to see that there actually is a lot of deterioration in the shape specifically of icebergs from when they first calve off, like the ones that I showed today, and their studies. And so this is just a snapshot of other geometries that they found. And you can see they're much more rounded. So in the left with the black background, that's the MIT iceberg that I showed. But all of the other pictures, these are all ones that they imaged. And you can see they're much rounder. They've melted out a lot more. They don't have specific water lines that they go by. So there has been a lot of rotation. Some are in pinnacles, and they have some very strange geometry. But they are much rounder in general than the ones that we see. So there is a lot of melting that is happening to smooth out these icebergs. So knowing where and when that happens is pretty important. Again, to go back to this question of how do we go from the geometry of these recently calved icebergs to the icebergs that have been out in the ocean for a while. And so then in summary, just to go over what we talked about today, we went over how to choose iceberg sites and the environmental considerations within these icebergs. Talked about 3 different methods of measuring iceberg melt directly, the high-resolution GPS, as well as multi-beam and the drone. We found about a surface lowering of 15 centimeters per day, which equates to an iceberg mass loss, 3.34 times 10 to the 5th meters cubed per day. And we also found a preliminary average melt rate of 0.46 to 0.73 meters per day, which is a bit larger, double or triple what previous studies have been able to account for. But we're not done yet. So this was our first season last year. We have another season coming up this year. And some of the changes that we will make, we need to have a greater distance between our differential GPS. We only had 65 meters and 85 meters. This limited what we could do as far as understanding the tilt of the icebergs, understanding what the overall melt rate was. Also, we were able, because we had 2 out, we were able to get the rotation of the iceberg, but it would be great to understand maybe how the iceberg behaves beyond just one small corner of it. Also, we need to place our expendable GPSs much farther away from our high resolution ones so we do not put noise into our records that doesn't need to be there. We are also going to increase our instrumented icebergs. So UNAVCO is providing 6 units this year instead of 2, and so we're able to instrument 4 icebergs. Additionally, the GPS units, instead of being deployed for 9 days, we are hoping to have them deployed for about a month. So hopefully we will get a much longer record of iceberg surface lowering rates and iceberg melt, and also be able to difference our DEMs with a lot more melt between the 2 of them. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. Leave you guys with a cool picture of an iceberg, and